Hello, I'm American Johnson. This is the Christmas special of Non-Compete, and we're taking it literally. We're going to talk about Jesus Christ. I'm here in Charleston, South Carolina, my hometown, also known as the Holy City because there are so many old, beautiful churches, and it would be a great place to film a video on Jesus because, you know, you can walk around and show all the pretty old churches and stuff, but apparently it's friggin' flooding downtown today. That's not gonna happen. So I borrowed a friggin' tablecloth from my mom to make a green screen, and we're doing this at my parents' house, and that's just the way it is. So, sorry. So before we get into this, let me tell you what this video is not gonna be. It's not going to be about religious stuff at all. I don't really care if you believe that Jesus was the divine Son of God, or if you're an atheist and you hate Christianity. None of that's going to matter for this video because I'm not talking about like the religion of Christianity. I'm talking about the more secular positions that Jesus held and the philosophy of Jesus Christ. And yeah, I also know some of you are going to be like, but Jesus didn't even exist historically. He was a figment of your imagination, and just cool it with that. It doesn't matter if Jesus was real or not, because the words that were attributed to Jesus have been the foundation for like 2,000 years of human thought in many places around the world. So just anyway, let's make a YouTube video. So yeah, as you can tell from my multiple disclaimers here, it's really hard to talk about the philosophy of Christ because it's wrapped up in centuries of cultural and religious baggage. There's so much controversy about religion, especially today, especially on YouTube. But I think you can strip away all of those religious aspects of Christianity, and we can examine the philosophical positions of Jesus. So the Gospels contain a pretty broad spectrum of moral teachings, and Jesus also touched on some political subjects in his teachings, and these are what are going to be primarily of interest to us when we're trying to figure out where Jesus is going to sit on that dirty commie, capitalist pig dog spectrum. But wait, you cry in turmoil and confusion. If Jesus Christ did exist, he lived about 18 centuries before capitalism and communism were ever even conceived of. So clearly there's no way that Jesus was actually a capitalist nor a socialist. I know that, you silly goose. I know that. So, you know, the best that we can do is examine what Jesus did say in relation to socioeconomic issues and politics, and try to extrapolate where he might stand today on the more modern subjects of capitalism and socialism. Render unto Caesar. So here's one of the first Bible stories that gets thrown around in this kind of discussion. There were these people called the Pharisees who wanted to kind of trap Jesus by forcing him to take a position against paying taxes to the Roman Empire. Because if Jesus said that they should not pay taxes, you know, that's like super illegal, and you know, he'd quickly be arrested by the Roman authorities and get in a lot of hot water. So the Pharisees came up to Jesus and they were like, so Jesus, you're a cool dude, so like, should we pay an imperial tax to Caesar or what? And Jesus, you know, Jesus was a smart guy. He saw right through this little scheme, and he was like, show me the coin you used to pay taxes. And they brought him a coin, and he was like, who's this dude on the coin? And they were like, well, that's Caesar, Jesus. And then Jesus was like, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. So this is one of the few things that Jesus said that was like directly related to something political, and therefore people have been arguing about its philosophical and political significance ever since. And before we go really deeper into the whole render unto Caesar thing, I want to talk about the way Jesus taught moral lessons. See, Jesus didn't usually tell his followers what to do directly. When anyone would ask him a question, he'd typically answer with like a parable or an anecdote, or by turning around and like asking them a question back. And this used to really annoy the crap out of me back when I would sit through Bible school every Sunday when I was a kid. And I'd always be sitting there like, come on, Jesus, why can't you just answer the freaking question already? And it wasn't until, you know, years later, actually pretty recently, that I realized the significance of this kind of teaching. in the context of Christianity and Christ's philosophy, because Christ seemed less interested in making like a long list of specific rules to follow, which a lot of religions, preceding it did. Christ was more interested in inspiring his followers to think for themselves. So to illustrate this point a little further, I'm going to take a look at another story which doesn't really have much to do with politics. And this one always confused the dickens out of me when I was in Sunday school. It's the story of the Good Samaritan. So there was this lawyer, and he went up to Jesus and he was like, hey Jesus, what do I need to do to get eternal life? And Jesus was like, well, you're a lawyer. What's written in the law? How do you read the law? And the lawyer was like, well, according to the law, you gotta love God with all your heart, and you gotta love your neighbor the same as you love yourself. And Jesus was like, yeah, man, cool, that's right. So just do that stuff and you'll live forever. But the lawyer was not happy with that answer. He wanted Jesus to be more specific. So he was like, but wait, Jesus, who is my neighbor?
What were they called? What were their names?
And Jesus answered with a story. And it goes like this. A dude was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he got robbed by some robbers, and they stripped him naked, and they beat him, and they left him half dead on the side of the road. So then later, a priest was going by, and he saw the naked dying dude, but he pretended he didn't see him, and he just kept on going. And then a few minutes later, a Levite came by, and he did the same thing, man. He just walked right on by without stopping. Then a Samaritan came by, and he saw the dying naked dude, and he was super worried, and he stopped and he poured oil and wine on his wounds, which was like, I guess, what they used for band-aids back then. Anyway, and then he put the dude on a donkey, and then he took him to an inn, and he gave the innkeeper 2 coins, and he was like, take care of this dude, man, he's in rough shape, and if you spend more than that, then I'll pay the rest when I come back. So then, after telling the story, Jesus looks at the lawyer and he asks, so, which of these 3 guys that walked past the dying dude do you think was his neighbor? And the lawyer said, the guy who showed mercy on him. And Jesus was like, yeah, so go and be like that Samaritan dude.
He's making it up as he goes along. No, I'm not.
Now, this story takes on a lot more meaning when you know about the Samaritans and the relationship that they had with the Jews. The Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews. They'd been hating each other for a really long time. The Jews actually destroyed the Samaritan temple. There was just bad blood between these people. And this is the real significance of the story. You see, the Jews hated the Samaritans so much that this story would have been completely shocking to the Jewish lawyer he was telling the story to. It was controversial. It was a hot take. So, this is how Jesus liked to teach people. He didn't tell the lawyer explicitly who to love as a neighbor. Instead, he answered with this kind of shocking parable about loving a person that you're trained to despise. And this was supposed to inspire the lawyer to think more deeply about the question's implications. So this brings us back to the render unto Caesar line. See, Jesus didn't answer the Pharisees directly whether or not the Jews should be paying the imperial taxes. He said, give Caesar what Caesar owns. It's a super indirect response. It can even come off as dodging the question. And this is exactly why people have been arguing about what Jesus really meant when he said render unto Caesar for hundreds and hundreds of years. Some people have interpreted render unto Caesar as a justification for obeying the secular laws of the land. And other people think it means that Jesus was arguing for a separation between church and state, which, is backed up by some other stuff that Jesus said. Like one time when he was being interrogated by Pontius Pilate over, the nature of his supposed kingdom. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from the world. So you could see this as maybe Jesus kind of dodging the question. It's definitely kind of vague. You could interpret that in many ways, and people have interpreted it in many ways over the years.
Don't pick your nose.
I wasn't picking my nose, I was scratching.
You was picking it while he was talking to that lady.
I wasn't.
Now, some people think that Jesus wants his followers to have personal choice as individuals on which laws to follow and which laws to break, since rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's raises the question automatically of, well, what belongs to Caesar? It's an answer that just leads to more questions, and I think that must have been the intent. The fact is, render unto Caesar is just too vague, and it's very open to interpretation, and that kind of limits its use in deciphering the political and economic outlook of old JC. So the fact that Jesus was so often in so many different stories, vague and indirect with his discourse, that gives some pretty stark contrast to a lot of what he said about money and greed and wealth. Like listen to these verses. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. If you would be perfect, go sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Whoever has 2 tunics is to share with him who has none, and whoever has food is to do likewise. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Do not store up treasures for yourself on the earth. I mean, the New Testament is just filled with lines like this. When Jesus talks about greed and selfishness and material possessions, it's honestly like the most direct that Jesus ever gets about anything. He clearly felt very strongly about these issues, and he laid out these concepts in no uncertain terms. I mean, Jesus basically thought that rich people were kind of assholes, and he strongly discouraged hoarding wealth, and he really very strongly recommended that human beings should love each other, as they love themselves, and share material possessions with one another, and he was not vague about these points at all. So that's most of what I could dig up as far as what Jesus explicitly said about economics and politics. But I think it's also important to see how Christ's earliest followers, the ones who were closest to Jesus, in time, interpreted these teachings and incorporated them into their lives. The book of Acts talks about some of the earliest Christians and how they lived. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Giving to each according to their need? Where have I heard that before? Anyway, it seems that the earliest Christians shared all their property in common, and they took care of each other, and they supported each other selflessly. So then there are the teachings of James and the book of James. Now, nobody's really sure who James was. All we know is that he was an early Christian, and his writings were rolled up into the New Testament as wisdom that followed and expanded on the teachings of Christ. And James actually wrote my personal favorite Bible verse. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasures in the last days. Behold the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Oh, that's brutal. So a lot of Christian socialists and Christian anarchists believe that Christ and the earliest Christians practiced and promoted a socialist way of life. And they think that the church has been in a state of decline ever since Emperor Constantine of Rome became a Christian and basically transformed the church from this humble, socialist, bottom-up organization into an authoritarian, top-down, state-sponsored hierarchy. This is known as the Constantinian shift, which puts the church at the hands of the ruling elite and merges Christianity with the state, ultimately leading to the foundation of the Catholic Church. Since the earliest foundation of the Catholic Church, debates have raged about how humans should incorporate the teaching of Christ into life on earth, And the early Roman Catholics romanticized poverty while building up incredible wealth within the church itself. And by the way, there's this guy, Francis of Assisi, and he made it really in vogue to romanticize poverty. And he created the first Franciscan orders where they would just live very simple lives. And a lot of people have attributed this to a glorification of poverty and used it as an excuse for exploiting the poor. So it's like, oh, it's noble to be poor. You should be glad that you're poor. Meanwhile, you'd have the bishops and the lords and the nobles and the kings and queens all living these lavish lives of luxury. And in fact, that's part of why Martin Luther was so disgusted by the wealth accumulation of the church. He thought it was very hypocritical. And interestingly, he was also disgusted by the secular developments of capitalism, which he witnessed in his day. There's a historian named Carter Lindbergh who wrote the following about Luther. Luther found the calculating entrepreneur extremely distasteful. He was convinced that the capitalist spirit divorced money from use for human needs and necessitated an economy of acquisition. Luther himself described these entrepreneurs as desiring that the entire world be ruined in order that there be hunger, thirst, misery, and need, so that he can have everything, and so that everyone must depend upon him and be his slave as if he were God. In the 19th century, the New Thought movement emerged in the USA, and this philosophy was first developed by Phineas Quimby as the mind cure movement. So Quimby believed that sickness and poverty are caused by an unfocused mind, and if you had faith in God and you focused your mind, you worked really hard, then you would live a healthy, prosperous life. These ideas were expanded on by Russell Conwell, who was another preacher in the late 19th century. He was really famous on the Chautauqua circuit. Chautauquas were basically like 19th century American TED Talks. So anyway, Conwell laid the foundations for modern day prosperity gospel. So his most famous speech was called Acres of Diamonds, and here's a choice little tidbit of an excerpt. I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. Let us remember that there is not a poor person in the United States who is not made poor by his own shortcomings. What a dick. So throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, New Thought Christian leaders like Quimby and Conwell taught that hard work and a focused mind would lead to prosperity, that you could make your own way in the world, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and Jesus wanted his followers to be prosperous. So later on, around the middle of the 20th century, this prosperity gospel was transformed even further by a new movement of tent revivals, which mingled Pentecostal faith healing beliefs with this New Thought prosperity gospel. And the most famous of these early prosperity evangelists was Oral Roberts, who began teaching prosperity theology in 1947. Roberts explained that donations to the church would be returned sevenfold, and he promised that any donation that you'd make to the church, if it did not lead to an equivalent unexpected payment, then he would return that donation back to the donor. So this kind of preaching leads to an even more egregious form of Christian profiteering. And you have faith healers like A.A. Allen, who's selling everything from a book called The Secret to Scriptural Financial Success to merchandise such as miracle tent shavings and prayer cloths soaked in miracle oil. In the 1960s, this prosperity gospel made the leap to television, and modern televangelism was born.
I think they like you.
There you go. They're wanting some of that chicken.
You're right. I think that's the housewives of America thanking you for fixing dinner tonight.
Okay, now look, I'm going to stop here. I personally feel like it's pretty obvious that this modern state of Christianity with prosperity gospel, it's pretty far removed from those original teachings of Christ.
You need Jesus!
Moving on. So how would Jesus weigh in on this modern question of capitalism versus socialism? Well, this is where we get into most capitalist sympathizing theologians who are telling us that Jesus would have adamantly opposed communism. They argue that Christ's typically vague and indirect answers were intended to convey advocacy for individualism. Lawrence W. Reed is the former CEO of BB&T, which is an evil, shitty bank I used to use. He had this to say about Jesus' line about rendering unto Caesar in an article for a right-wing libertarian think tank. Notice that everything depends on just what truly did belong to Caesar and what didn't, which is actually a rather powerful endorsement of property rights. Jesus said nothing like, "It belongs to Caesar," if Caesar simply says it does, no matter how much he wants, how he gets it, or how he chooses to spend it. Now, I'm a dirty, dirty communist, so admittedly I'm biased, but to me this interpretation that Jesus was advocating for property rights when he said "render unto Caesar" requires a tremendous amount of torturous lawyering. I just find it to be a very bad faith interpretation. Remember, Jesus might not have explicitly said you are not allowed to hoard wealth and withhold support for your fellow human beings. That might not be like a black and white rule according to Jesus. And he might not have advocated explicitly for a modern communist revolution, you know, the way that Marx describes, but Jesus absolutely implored humanity to utterly abandon wealth and to share everything in common with our neighbors. So it's not surprising to me that a friggin' bank CEO would have some, you know, cognitive dissonance about these teachings, but seriously, this is just a weird interpretation to me, and it's absolutely, it feels like an attempt to twist and control the framework of the question, because this interpretation requires us to focus on the letter of Christ's law and not the spirit. Reconciling capitalism with the philosophies of Jesus requires us to hyperfixate on what Christ did not say. You know, Christ did not say we have to share with each other. Therefore, I can be a rich banker and hold millions of dollars in personal wealth and grow rich by exploiting poor people through credit card interest and overdraft fees. Jesus didn't say I'm not allowed to do that.
You check in your rule book, but you won't find anything in there that says a dog can't play.
He's right. Ain't no rule said the dog can't play basketball.
I mean, this position just completely ignores all the things that Jesus did say very clearly about how you should really, really, really consider abandoning your wealth and living in commune with your neighbors and treating others as you want to be treated, and love each other and love other human beings as much as you love yourself. I don't know, there's a lot more that can be said on this subject. We've really just barely scratched the surface here. Was Jesus a communist? I mean, not explicitly. I don't even think he would have had the context to understand what modern communism and capitalism even are in our modern context. But I do think that Jesus spoke out against the foundational philosophies of capitalism, because capitalism worships the accumulation of material wealth. Capitalism conflates the value of a human being with financial success. Capitalists exploit other people to put themselves ahead. And under capitalism, it's taken for granted that some people will have and some people will not. If Jesus were alive today, would he be a communist? Would he be an anarchist? Would he abstain from politics altogether? I have no idea. But I'm pretty sure about one thing: Jesus would have hated capitalism. I know I do. I'm American Johnson. This is Non-Compete. See you next time. Happy holidays, everybody.
Why don't you all pass chicken out to the studio audience before it gets cold right now? And
Yeah, don't let it get cold.
There. And
Yeah, Colonel, let's have a piece.
Henry.
Oh, Jim.
I knew Henry is dying over there just smelling that chicken over
Yeah, I'm drooling.
I'm looking for a wing, but I don't see it.
Give me that whole bucket of chicken. I'll give it to Henry. Henry will.
I have a bite while they have a bite.
Yeah. Find the Colonel a wing there. He likes wings. Grandma Irwin liked the wing, too. That was her favorite. So, Colonel...
Yeah, there we go.
Everybody's eating it. Well, here we are handing it.
Right here.
Colonel, I'm sorry. Excuse the fingers here.
Here.
It's finger licking good anyway, huh? Is that what they say?
Yep.